The alien sorceress princess was perishing, until a human warrior made the ultimate sacrifice. The ground shook like it was trying to break free of itself. Corporal Ethan Cole hit the dirt behind a crumbled wall of what used to be a communications relay, his rifle pressed to his chest, breathing hard. Smoke was everywhere. The air smelled like burning copper and something else, something alien, sharp and sweet at the same time, like singed flowers. It came from her. She was lying 20 meters ahead of him in the open, half buried under a collapsed beam of what the recon team had called a star pillar. Some kind of crystalline structure. The Vareni used to amplify their energy fields. The structure had fallen during the orbital bombardment that opened the battle. Most of the Vareni forces had scattered, but she had not. Ethan had never seen a Vareni this close. In briefings, they showed you holographic slides. Tall, four-armed skin that shifted between silver and pale violet depending on the light. Their eyes were large and dark, wide like a deep well with no bottom. The Vareni called themselves children of the old stars. Humans mostly just called them the enemy. Except the war had ended 6 hours ago. The ceasefire had come through on Ethan's comm unit, while he was still clearing the eastern ridge with his squad. A flat, mechanical voice from command, like it was reading a grocery list. All hostilities were to cease immediately. A peace accord had been signed at the neutral station in orbit. Representatives of both species had agreed to terms. The war that had chewed through 3 star systems and taken 9 million lives, human and Vareni alike, was over. Nobody told the debris that. Nobody told the fires. Nobody told the radiation leaking out of the cracked star pillar that was slowly poisoning the woman lying beneath it. Because that is what she was. Ethan could see it even from here. She was young, not old enough to be a soldier in his estimation. The robes she wore were torn, scorched at the edges. One of her 4 hands was pressed flat against the ground, and the other 3 were pulled toward her body, trembling. The symbols on her robes, circular patterns like rings within rings, marked her as something important. He had seen that symbol in a briefing once. The word the translator gave for it was vessel, someone who carried and channeled their world's energy, a sorceress in the oldest human sense of the word. He crawled forward, not because command told him to, not because it was in the mission brief. He crawled because she looked at him. Her dark eyes found him through the smoke, and she did not look away. She did not look afraid. She looked like someone who had already made peace with dying, who was only watching him now out of curiosity. Like she wanted to see, in her last few minutes, what a human would choose to do. His squad leader, Corporal Luis Peralta, grabbed his ankle. "Cole, what are you doing? There's someone out there." "There's nothing out there, that's our problem anymore. The ceasefire." "She's going to die, Luis." A pause, the kind of pause that carries a lot of weight. "She might already be dying from the rad leak off that pillar. You go out there, you catch it too." "I know." Ethan pulled his ankle free and kept crawling. He heard Luis curse behind him, heard the sound of boots shifting, and then heard Luis say quietly to the rest of the squad, "Cover him." Both sides. The open ground between the wall and the star pillar was about 40 feet of broken stone, ash and shattered glass-like shards from the pillar itself. Every shard glowed faintly, a pale violet light, pulsing in a slow and irregular rhythm, like a heartbeat that kept losing count. He reached her in under 2 minutes. Up close, she was even younger than he had thought. Her silver-violet skin was dull, grayed at the edges of her face, which he had learned meant blood loss or something close to it in their physiology. Her 4 hands were shaking. The beam pinning her was not crushing her. It had fallen across her legs at an angle, trapping without fully breaking, and he could see by the way she held herself that she was spending what little energy she had left to keep the weight from pressing down completely. The radiation meter on his wrist ticked up, then again, then faster. She looked at him. She said something. Her voice was low, harmonic. Vareni speech had a quality like 2 notes played together, always slightly apart in pitch, the way a stringed instrument would sound if it had never been tuned. He had no translator unit. His was broken in the first hour of the battle when a shockwave threw him 10 feet into a wall. He did not know what she said, but he answered anyway. "I'm going to get that off you," he said. "Don't move or do move. I honestly don't know what the right thing to tell you is, but I'm going to help." He put his shoulder against the beam and pushed. The beam weighed something between impossible and nearly impossible. His boots scraped against the stone. His arms screamed. His vision went a little white at the edges. The radiation meter ticked faster. The pale violet light from the shards pulsed all around them, brighter now, and he realized distantly, the way you realize something when your whole body is occupied with something else, that the light was responding to her, that she was doing something. That even now, half dying, she was somehow adding to his effort, channeling something from the broken pillar into the space between them. The beam shifted. He pushed harder. It rolled. She pulled herself free with 2 of her hands, the other 2 trailing, one of them hanging at an angle that was clearly wrong. She moved maybe 3 feet and then stopped, breathing in long, thin draws. Her robes dragged ash across the stone. Ethan dropped to his knees beside her. The radiation meter was clicking steadily now, not beeping in alarm but insistent. He had been out here too long already. He pulled the emergency wrap from his kit and began sealing his skin as best he could, pulling the hood up, fastening the collar. Then he looked at her and understood that she had no such protection, and that the pillar she had been next to, the one that was now cracked and leaking, had been leaking into her for much longer than it had been leaking into him. He did the only thing he could think of. He unzipped the emergency wrap, pulled it off himself, and began draping it over her. She stared at him. He kept working, pulling the edges around her, sealing what he could, ignoring the fact that the wrap was designed for one human body and her 4 arms in different proportions made it a very poor fit. He sealed the hood. He tucked the edges under her. He did his level best. She said something again, the same 2-noted sound, slower this time with a different shape to it. "You're welcome," Ethan said, though he had no idea if that was the right response. He sat back on his heels and looked at his own unprotected hands. The meter on his wrist was ticking fast now. He could feel the faint warmth in his skin that probably meant nothing good. But she was still alive, and she was watching him, and her eyes had changed. They were not the eyes of someone who had made peace with dying anymore. They were the eyes of someone who had just been surprised by the living. Lewis's voice crackled over the comm unit. "Cole, we have medical inbound. 4 minutes, you hear me? 4 minutes." Ethan leaned against a piece of the fallen wall, close enough to be beside her, far enough not to crowd her. He looked up at the sky. Through the smoke, he could make out the dark curve of the gas giant that this moon orbited, vast and brown-orange, hanging there like it had been watching all of this without any opinion. 4 minutes, he said to no one in particular. She said something else. This time she reached out with one of her trembling silver hands, not the broken one, and pressed 2 fingers. She had 6 fingers on each hand, long and tapered against the back of his wrist. Not grabbing, just touching, like she was reading something. The radiation meter slowed. He looked down at his wrist. It kept slowing. Within 15 seconds it had stopped clicking entirely. He looked at her. She had her eyes closed and her lips were moving, and the violet glow from the shards all around them had shifted, pulling inward, pulling toward her, pulling away from the air around him. She was pulling it out of him. Even now, half broken, she was pulling it out of him. He did not move. He sat very still and let her. The medical team arrived at 3 minutes and 40 seconds. The first person through the smoke was Private Carla Sutton, who was small and fast and had been with the unit for 8 months, and who stopped dead when she saw what she was looking at. An alien Vareni sorceress princess, draped in an emergency wrap, pressing her fingers to the wrist of a human corporal who was sitting quietly beside her like they had known each other for years. "Cole," Carla said slowly. "Hey," Ethan said. "You want to tell me what's happening here?" "She's hurt," The beam got her legs, radiation exposure prolonged. One arm is broken, maybe two. And he paused, looking at the meter on his wrist, which now read almost nothing. She needs your help more than I do. Carla looked at the alien woman. The alien woman looked at Carla. Then she lowered her fingers from Ethan's wrist, very slowly, and something in her expression shifted. All four of her hands came together in front of her chest, the way that Ethan would later learn. The Vareni offered acknowledgement to someone they considered worth remembering. Carla turned back to her kid. "All right," she said, "let's figure out how to keep her alive." Outside the walls of the shattered relay station, the gas giant kept hanging in the sky, and the war kept being over, and for the first time in 3 years, the shooting had stopped. Something else had started, though, something none of them had a word for yet. The medical transport that carried her was not designed for Vareni anatomy, and the medics spent most of the 40-minute flight to the orbital station improvising. Carla worked on the broken arms, 2 of them, as it turned out, using the portable brace kit, and more guesswork than anyone felt comfortable admitting. The sorceress did not make a sound during any of it. She watched the ceiling of the transport with those wide, dark eyes, and every so often she would glance at Ethan, who was sitting on the bench across from her, and he would nod in what he hoped was a reassuring way. He had been ordered to stay behind. He had not stayed behind. Lewis had given him exactly one long, flat look and then said nothing, which was as close to permission as the man ever gave. The radiation exposure was mild, they told him on the transport, the kind that faded. He would need monitoring and a round of treatment pills and some rest, and he would be fine. The sorceress had more exposure than him, and she was not fine, but she was stable, which was a different thing. At the orbital station, things got complicated. The station was a neutral platform, jointly administered since the ceasefire. That was the theory, anyway. In practice, it was a human station with a Vareni delegation on Deck 3, and the two groups had been navigating each other with the careful precision of people walking through a room full of fragile things. When the transport docked and they brought her out on a stretcher, a human stretcher, padded with folded thermal blankets to adjust for the differences in her anatomy, the Vareni on Deck 3 heard about it in approximately 4 minutes. The delegation sent 3 people immediately. Ethan was sitting in the corridor outside the medical bay, filling out an incident report on a flat screen, when he heard the sound of them coming. Vareni footsteps were softer than human footsteps. They were taller, and they moved with a kind of deliberate economy of motion that always made Ethan think of something large trying to be quiet. He looked up, and there were 3 of them in the corridor, all in formal gray robes, all looking at him with expressions he could not fully read. The one in front spoke. His translation unit, clipped behind his ear, gave him the words in flat synthetic English a half-second later. "You are the soldier who brought her here." "Yes," Ethan said. "Why?" It was such a direct question that he almost laughed, because she needed help. The 3 Vareni looked at each other. Something passed between them, some communication that did not involve words. Then the one in front looked back at Ethan. "She is the second vessel of the Keth line," he said, the translation unit rendering it carefully. "She holds the resonance of 7 generations. She was accompanying a diplomatic team when the bombardment," he stopped, started again. "She was not supposed to be on the surface." "She was on the surface," Ethan said simply. Another look between them. The one in front said, "You were exposed." "A little. You gave her your protection while you had none." Ethan considered saying something modest and decided against it. He had done what he had done. There was no point in softening it into something smaller. "Yes," he said. The Vareni in front of him was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, the translation unit rendered his words with an odd hesitation, the way it always did when it encountered a phrase that did not have a clean equivalent. "In our language," he said, "there is a word for what you did. It is approximately rendered in yours as, you placed your shadow over her son." Ethan thought about that. I just lifted a beam, he said. You lifted a beam, the Vareni agreed. And then you stayed. He did not know what to say to that, so he said nothing. After a moment, the three Vareni moved past him toward the medical bay door, and the lead one paused with his hand on the frame. You will be informed of her condition, he said, and she has asked when she could speak clearly again that you be told her name. Ethan looked up. Her name is Sale, the Vareni said. Then they went inside. Ethan sat in the corridor with his incident report half done, and the name sitting in his mind like something he would not forget even if he tried. Sale. He had not expected that. He did not know what he had expected exactly, some formal acknowledgement, maybe, or a dismissal, or nothing at all. Not a name. Names were something you gave to people you intended to know. He set down the flat screen and looked at the ceiling of the corridor, which was gray and featureless, and offered no particular wisdom. The station hummed around him, full of soldiers and diplomats and engineers and medical staff, and all the complex machinery of a ceasefire that everyone hoped would become a peace. He thought about her eyes, the way they had changed. Outside the hull of the station, space was doing what space always did, being enormous and cold and entirely indifferent. But inside, in a medical bay on a neutral orbital platform, a Vareni sorceress named Sale was alive, and her name was in his head, and none of the math he knew how to do quite added up to an explanation for how any of this had happened. He picked up the flat screen and went back to his incident report. Under the field that said reason for field action, he typed, she was hurt and I was there. He figured that would have to be enough. 3 days passed on the station before she was well enough to move through the corridors. Ethan saw her for the first time outside the medical bay on the morning of the 4th day, when he was getting coffee from the dispenser near the junction of decks 2 and 3. He heard the soft footsteps and turned, and there she was. She was moving carefully, the way someone moves when they are still relearning their body after something hard. 2 of her 4 arms were in light braces, and she walked with a slight lean to the left. She saw him at the same moment he saw her. She was taller than he had registered on the surface. Standing fully upright, she had 6 inches on him, maybe 7. Her skin had recovered some of its color, the silver-violet cleaner now less gray. She wore plain robes that were clearly borrowed or newly issued, without the symbolic rings that had marked her torn ones. Her eyes, up close and in the station's clean white lighting, were not simply dark. They had a depth to them, layers, the way very old glass sometimes looks. They stood in the corridor and looked at each other. He raised his cup. Coffee, he said, it's a human thing. I would offer you some, but I genuinely have no idea if it would help or hurt you. Her translation unit, a Vareni model, smaller and less visible than the human ones, rendered something in English after a moment's processing. Her actual voice underneath it had that 2-note harmonic quality, the paired pitches that made her sound like music being attempted. I am told, the unit said, that it smells like heated soil and bitterness. That's an accurate description, yeah. Something shifted in her expression. He was learning to read her face in the rough, uncertain way you read a map in a language you do not speak, mostly guessing, occasionally right. I have been told your name, she said, Ethan Cole. And I was told yours, he said, Sale. She looked at him steadily. You said it correctly. Did I? No human has said it correctly before. Our sounds are difficult for your mouths. Ethan considered this. I've been saying it to myself for 3 days, he said. That probably helped. The thing that crossed her face then was not a smile. Vareni faces did not quite smile. The muscles worked differently, but it was something in that direction. Something warm and almost startled, like a light coming on in a room you expected to be empty. Why, she said, have you been saying my name for 3 days? It was a fair question. He did not have a clean answer for it. I don't know, he said. I just couldn't stop. She looked at him for a long moment, the way she had looked at him through the smoke on the surface, with that quality of careful attention, like she was reading something that mattered. "I could not stop either," she said, "thinking of you." The coffee dispenser beeped behind him, dispensing a second cup for someone else. The station hummed. Somewhere on deck 3, a door opened and closed. Neither of them moved. "I need to tell you something," Sale said, "about what I did to you on the surface. You pulled the radiation out of me." "I did more than that." She paused. Her translation unit lagged slightly on her next words, as if the concept required careful handling. "When a vessel touches someone during a drawing, what you call pulling out the harm, we also leave something. It is not intentional. It is simply what happens. We cannot do one without the other." Ethan felt a slow, careful feeling move through him. "What do you leave?" "A thread," she said, "of resonance. It fades in most cases. In a very short time, nothing remains." She looked at him with an expression that was entirely readable across every species line, because it was the expression of someone telling you something they are not sure how you will receive. In some cases, it does not fade. The corridor was quiet. "Is that what's happening?" Ethan asked. "I believe so," she said. He thought about the 3 days on the station, the way her name had sat in his mind. The way he had come to the coffee dispenser this morning at this particular time without quite deciding to. The way he had felt, in some low and wordless part of himself, that she was close. He thought about the war that had just ended. 9 million dead. 3 star systems burned and broken. All of it now supposed to be behind them, and this woman standing in front of him, this person he had met in the ash and smoke, looking at him with those layered dark eyes and telling him there was a thread between them. "Does it bother you," he asked, "that it didn't fade?" She considered the question seriously, the way she seemed to consider everything. "No," she said. "But it may complicate your life in ways I cannot predict. My life has been complicated before. Not like this." He thought she was probably right about that. "What happens," he said, "to people who have the thread between them? From your side, I mean, in your history, what do you know about it?" She looked at him calmly. "They tend to find each other difficult to be far from," she said. "They tend to understand each other in ways others do not. They tend," the translation unit paused, processing, "to matter to each other in a way that does not have a simple name." Ethan drank his coffee. It was cooling now, past the point where it was at its best, but he drank it anyway. "That sounds," he said, "like the beginning of something." "It does," she agreed. And this time, the thing that crossed her face was something he had no difficulty reading at all. The peace talks lasted 11 days on the orbital station. Ethan was not supposed to be part of them. He was a corporal with a rifle and a mostly healed radiation read, and a commanding officer who had stopped pretending to be annoyed about any of this somewhere around day 5. His commanding officer, Captain Diane Reyes, who had seen 42 years of things she had not expected, and had developed a deep practical philosophy about which things were worth fighting and which were worth letting happen, simply reassigned him to the station's security detail and stopped asking questions. Sale was not supposed to be part of the peace talks either, at least not officially. She was too young, the Vareni delegation said. She was still recovering, they said. Her role was spiritual and ceremonial, not diplomatic. She attended every session anyway. Ethan stood his security post outside the main conference room and watched the doors, and twice a day the doors opened and Sale walked in or walked out, and every time she passed him she slowed her steps by a fraction, just enough to exchange the kind of look that carried an entire conversation, and then she kept walking. He was not sure when it had become the part of the day he looked forward to most. What he did know was that something was changing on the station, and he was not imagining it. The Vareni delegation had arrived formal and guarded, moving through the human spaces with careful, deliberate distance. By day 4, that distance had shifted. Small things, but visible. A Vareni attaché and a human engineer working together on a translation of a technical document, bent over the same screen. one of the Vareni advisors eating in the common dining area instead of the private Vareni section. A human medic learning to read Vareni vital signs from a Vareni healer, both of them talking rapidly with their hands. On day 6, Ethan overheard something in the corridor outside the conference room that he would think about for a long time after. 2 diplomats, 1 human, 1 Vareni, were standing in the hallway disagreeing about a resource clause in the draft accord. They were disagreeing fiercely. Both of their translators were working hard. And then something shifted in the conversation, some turning point, and the human diplomat laughed. A short, surprised laugh, and the Vareni diplomat made a sound that Ethan had never heard a Vareni make, a rapid rising tone that he would later learn was the equivalent of laughing. And the tension went out of both of them at once, and they kept talking but differently. Ethan thought about that a lot. How easy it was when you were laughing together to forget why you were supposed to be afraid of each other. On day 8, he had the first real conversation with Sale that was longer than a corridor exchange. The station had a small observation deck on its top level, a domed room with a clear ceiling and a wide view of the stars, and he found her there at what passed for evening on the station, sitting on a bench with her repaired arms crossed in her lap, watching the stars in the particular way that meant she was not really watching anything, she was thinking. He sat down on the other end of the bench and said nothing for a while. It turned out that silence with Sale was not awkward. It had a shape to it, a texture, something that had to do with the thread, maybe, or just with who she was, some quality of presence that made the quiet feel inhabited rather than empty. After a few minutes she said, "Tell me something about your world." He thought about it. Which world? I grew up on 2. She looked at him. You were born in space. Born on Earth. Earth it's the original human planet. But my mother worked on a station in the outer system when I was a child, and I spent 4 years there with her. So I have 2 homes and belong fully to neither, which is something I have been told is very common among people who grow up the way I did. We have a word for that, Sale said. People who live between places. It translates approximately as those who carry the shape of everywhere. I like that, he said. It is considered an honor among us, she said. Not an easy one, but an honor. He thought about that. Growing up, the sense of belonging nowhere had not felt like an honor. It had felt like a permanent low-level ache. But maybe the way you described something changed what it was, a little. Maybe the shape of everywhere was another way of saying that no door was fully closed to you because you had already been on both sides. Tell me about your people, he said. Not the politics, something real. She was quiet for a moment, deciding. When a vessel is young, she said, before the training, before the ceremony, we can see the light that living things give off. It is not visible to others, but we see it in everything, in people, in animals, in the soil after rain, in old trees, in the moment before dawn when the air is still and the light is changing. Everything alive gives off something. Everything that matters gives off something. She paused. The training teaches us to manage what we see. To not be overwhelmed, but sometimes, rarely, we meet someone whose light is very bright and very still at the same time. That is rare. Bright usually means unsettled. Still usually means dim. Another pause. When I saw you through the smoke, you were very bright and very still. Ethan looked at the stars. I was terrified, he said. I know, she said. That made it more unusual, not less. They sat with that for a while. What does the thread feel like, he asked, from your end? She considered. Like knowing a direction, she said. Like the way water knows which way is down. I always know which direction you are. And from my end, he said slowly, I don't have the same, I don't have your abilities, but I keep ending up in the same places as you without deciding to. I woke up this morning and I thought about coming here, and I didn't ask myself why. Yes, she said softly, it works in both directions. It simply feels different depending on what you are built to receive. Are you worried about it? She turned to look at him fully. Her dark eyes in the observation dome were full of reflected stars. No, she said, are you? He thought about the war. He thought about 3 years of running toward things and away from things, and trying to hold on to the parts of himself that mattered. He thought about the ash on the surface of that moon, and a beam pinning someone to the ground, and the particular quality of stillness that had been in him when he pushed. Not the stillness of not being afraid, but the stillness of knowing exactly what the right thing was. No, he said. Outside the dome, the stars did what they always did, burned cold and vast and indifferent. But inside, on a bench in an observation room on a neutral station, two people from two different species who had been at war 3 weeks ago sat in the comfortable shape of a shared silence, and neither of them had a word yet for what this was. They did not need one yet. On the 9th day, things went wrong. Not with the peace talks. Those were progressing with the slow, grinding seriousness of large agreements between exhausted peoples who had stopped wanting to fight. What went wrong was smaller and more dangerous than a war, a rumor. Ethan heard it first from Private Troy Halloran, who was young and nervous, and had the unhappy talent of being near wherever gossip originated. Halloran stopped him in the corridor outside the security post at shift change and said, quietly, looking over his shoulder, "You heard about the Vareni data leak." Ethan had not. He heard the rest of it in pieces over the following 2 hours, and by the time he had assembled the whole story, it was not good. A Vareni technical officer, according to the rumor, had been found accessing a restricted section of the station's comm relay. Not breaking in, just accessing. Listening. The human security team had flagged it and reported it to Command, and Command had brought it to the peace talks delegation, and now both sides were sitting in a room looking at each other across a table that had been fragile to begin with, and the fragile thing was in danger. He went to Captain Ray's. She was in her office on Deck 2, which was a room barely large enough to contain her reputation, and she looked at him over her desk with the expression of someone who had already done 6 hard things today and was prepared to do a 7th. "You heard," she said. "I heard the rumor." "The rumor is mostly accurate. One of their tech officers was listening to communications from a restricted channel. We don't know why yet. Could be espionage. Could be a mistake, could be something else entirely." She looked at him. "Why are you here, Cole?" "I think I can help." She looked at him for a long moment. "Because of her," she said, not a question. "Because I can talk to someone who can actually find out what happened," he said, "without it going through 4 layers of delegation and getting worse with every layer." Ray's tapped her desk slowly. She was not someone who decided things quickly, but she was someone who, once she decided, did not waver. "You are still officially on security detail," she said, "and security personnel are permitted to confer with members of the visiting delegation on matters relating to station safety." She looked at her screen. "Go." He found Sale in the Vareni section of Deck 3, in a small common room that the station had provided for the delegation's private use. She was alone, standing at the wide window that looked out at the station's solar array, her arms folded, 2 of her 4 hands pressed together in front of her. She turned when he came in, and he could tell from the way she held herself that she already knew. "Tell me what actually happened," he said. She was quiet for a moment, not deciding whether to trust him. That was already settled, and they both knew it. Deciding how to explain something that had no clean explanation. "Voss is very young," she said finally. "He is one of our technical officers. He is 20 years old by your counting. He lost his sister in the battle of the 2nd system. He did not come on this mission as a spy." She stopped. "He was listening to the Human Memorial Channel, the one your station broadcasts internally, the channel where people leave recorded messages for the ones they lost." Ethan stood very still. "He was listening," she said, "because he wanted to hear what grief sounded like from your side. He wanted to know." She stopped again, and something shifted in her expression, something that he was learning to recognize as the Vareni equivalent of pain. He wanted to know if it felt the same. The room was quiet. "Does it?" Ethan asked. He said, Sale said carefully, that it sounds exactly the same. Ethan sat down in one of the chairs that had been provided for the Vareni delegation, which were too tall for him and shaped wrong for his spine, and he sat in it anyway. "I'm going to tell my captain what you just told me," he said, "and she is going to tell the delegation lead, and there is going to be a conversation, and it is probably going to be an uncomfortable one. But I think if we tell it right, it does not have to break what we are building." Sale looked at him. "You believe that?" "I think grief is a better starting point than most things," he said. "At least it means both sides know what they are fighting to protect." She was silent for a moment. Then she crossed the room and sat in the chair across from him, 4 arms folding into a posture he was beginning to recognize as her version of considered and deliberate. "In our history," she said, "the truces that became real peace were always built on something true, not on policy, not on resource clauses or territorial agreements, on something that both sides recognized as real." She looked at him steadily. "A young man listening to your grief because he wanted to understand if his own grief made sense, that is something true." "I'm going to go tell Reyes," Ethan said. "Will Voss confirm it?" "I will speak to him," Sale said. "Give me 20 minutes. He stood, she stood. They were close enough in the small room that the thread between them, whatever it was, whatever name it would eventually find, pulled taut in that particular way that had no physical explanation. He was aware of it the way you are aware of your own heartbeat when the room gets quiet enough. "Ethan," she said. He waited. "Thank you," she said, "for coming to me instead of going around me." "I wouldn't go around you," he said. "I know," she said. "That is what I am thanking you for." He left. 23 minutes later the conversation happened. It was uncomfortable as he had predicted. It lasted 4 hours. At the end of it, Voss, a young Vareni with steady eyes and the visible posture of someone bracing to receive judgment, stood before a mixed room of human and Vareni diplomats, and explained, through a translator, what he had been listening to and why. There was a long silence after he finished. The human lead negotiator, an older woman named Patricia Daly who had spent 30 years trying to prevent and end conflicts, leaned back in her chair and said, quietly, "I'm glad you listened." The Vareni delegation lead, who bore a title that translated as first voice, looked at Voss for a long moment and then said something in Vareni that Ethan's translation unit rendered as, "That was a brave thing to go looking for." Voss sat down. The negotiation continued. On the 11th day, the peace accord was signed. Ethan watched from the gallery above the main conference room. He was officially security, and the gallery was part of his post, and he was officially watching the room. What he was actually doing was watching Sale, who stood at the side of the room with the rest of the Vareni delegation in her borrowed robes, and who at the moment the signatures were applied to the accord, turned her head slightly and looked up at him in the gallery, as if she had known exactly where he was. He had known exactly where she was. He always did now. The accord signing was followed by a reception on the neutral deck, which was the most complicated meal Ethan had ever attended, because nobody was entirely sure what anyone else could eat, and the station's kitchen staff had prepared 40 separate options covering both species' known safe foods, and everyone stood around with plates and tried to navigate it with as much dignity as possible and largely succeeded. He found Sale standing near the observation window with a small plate of something pale and layered that he recognized as a Vareni grain preparation. He had a cup of coffee because he had stopped apologizing for it. "It's done," he said. "It is a beginning," she said. "Accords are what you sign before the actual work starts." That's a fairly dark way to look at it. It is accurate. It is, he agreed, but it's still better than where we were. She looked at him. "Yes," she said, "considerably." They stood for a while. People moved around them, human and Vareni, and the mixed conversations that were happening with increasing ease across the room. The thread pulled with its quiet insistence, and he was so used to it now that it was less like a pull and more like a home note, the low sound a room makes when everything in it is where it belongs. "What happens next?" he asked, "for you?" "I return with the delegation," she said. "I have duties at home. The recovery process for a vessel after an incident like mine is long. I will be monitored, tested, guided. It will take time." She looked at him directly. "What happens for you?" "I'm being rotated back to Earth in 3 weeks," he said. "Standard post-conflict reassignment. After that, I don't know. The military is going to restructure. Things will change." She nodded slowly. "The thread," she said carefully, "does not require proximity to hold. It will not disappear because we are far apart." "But far apart is still far apart," he said. "Yes," she said, "it is." They were quiet for a moment. "This is not a goodbye," he said, "not quite a question." "No," she said, "I do not believe it is." The reception continued around them. Patricia Daly was talking to the first voice with a relaxed posture that would have been unimaginable 11 days ago. Carla Sutton was explaining something about human cardiovascular anatomy to a Vareni healer who was listening with intense attention. Voss was standing with a young human comm technician, both of them looking at something on a flat screen, their heads closed together in the way of people working on something that matters. Ethan looked at all of it. He thought about the surface of the moon, the ash and the smoke, the violet light of the cracked pillar, the weight of the beam under his shoulder, the moment when she had looked at him through the smoke with eyes that expected nothing and received something anyway. He thought about what she had said, about how still he had been and how bright. He had not known in that moment that stillness was unusual. He had not been thinking about it. He had just known what the right thing to do was, in that simple and total way that occasionally life grants you. The way a path makes itself clear not because everything else is gone, but because one direction suddenly makes all the sense there is. He had a thought then that he almost said out loud. He turned it over for a moment, checking it, finding it solid. "Sail," he said. She looked at him. "Whatever the thread is," he said, "I don't want to lose the other end of it." She was still for a moment. The reception moved around them, full of the beginning sounds of a world that was trying to figure out how to stop being afraid of itself. "Then you will not," she said. It was not a promise exactly. It was something truer than a promise, an assessment made by someone who read light and resonance and the things that living held, and who had looked at him in the smoke and seen something still and bright, and who had left a thread she did not regret leaving. He nodded, she nodded. They stood at the observation window and looked out at the stars, which were doing what stars always do, burning, steady across distances that made everything seem impossibly far and somehow, inexplicably close. The war was over. The work had started. And between a human soldier and an alien sorceress, something that had no name yet was growing in the careful, patient way that things grow when they are given time and the right conditions. Slowly, and then all at once, the way light does when the long night finally ends.